Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for your support and love, it truly means a lot. I wish you all good health and happiness. Today we'll continue with episode 15, sharing the next chapter in the story of Ly Tu Tien. Let's dive in together. Early morning at the construction site, Jack was closely monitoring the concrete pouring for the foundation of a new building when his phone rang. It was his mother. Her voice sounded a little weak as she mentioned she had been feeling dizzy and had a headache since the night before, but didn't want to bother him. Jack immediately frowned, told her to take her usual blood pressure medication and rest. He then quickly delegated the site work to Hoai and drove straight home without delay. As soon as he arrived, Jack called Dr. Tieu to come examine her. After a thorough checkup, the doctor diagnosed a recurrence of high blood pressure, likely triggered by the sudden change in weather. She advised a few days of rest and a light, low-sodium diet. Jack stayed by her bedside, adjusting her pillow, tucking in the blanket, and then went to the kitchen to make her a warm cup of milk. Though he had dealt with this many times before, every time he saw his mother unwell, it still stirred worry in his heart. While he was preparing porridge in the kitchen, Tuchian appeared at the door, holding a small basket with a few eggs and a piece of meat. Having heard from the village chief that Jack's mother was sick, she had walked over to visit. Jack's mother brightened the moment she saw her. "I'm already feeling better just seeing you," she said with a gentle smile. Tu Tien shyly sat on the edge of the bed, unpacking the items from the basket one by one. "I only managed to get a few things from the market," she said softly, "but I hope they'll help you feel better." Deeply touched, Jack's mother held her hand warmly, chatting with her like an old friend. Jack came upstairs from the kitchen and paused at the doorway. He stood quietly for a moment, watching the scene unfold, then finally walked in and joined the conversation. Later, Tu Tien came down to help him finish cooking the porridge. The meal was brought up shortly after, and the three of them sat together, sharing the warm, home-cooked food in a comforting silence. Tu Tien served the porridge and cleaned the table, while Jack poured water and brought out fresh fruit. His mother looked at the two of them, her eyes filled with joy she couldn't hide. Jack watched as his mother and Tu Tien sat side by side, holding hands and chatting animatedly. The sight brought a quiet peace to his heart. All the stress from work, the pressure of daily responsibilities, suddenly none of it mattered. He didn't need anything grand, just coming home to this. His mother, healthy, Tu Tien by her side, was enough to make him feel truly at peace. The afternoon passed gently in the small kitchen. After the meal, Tu Tien helped Jack tidy up, put the leftovers away and brewed tea for his mother. Before leaving, she gently reminded her to take her medicine on time. Jack's mother held her hand one more time, still smiling, her eyes filled with warmth that lingered long after Tu Tien stepped out the door. Leaving the construction site after checking the progress of the new road's concrete pouring, Jack drove along the red dirt path that led to the lower village. The early afternoon sun wasn't too harsh, but it was enough to soak his shirt in sweat. Today, there was something important he had to get done. No matter what. After a few winding turns, he pulled over and asked for directions to Mr. Quan's house, a man who once owned a small farm that had long since been abandoned. Mr. Quan lived a reclusive life, in an old stilt house nestled between rows of betel trees and cassava fields. Jack had to follow a narrow path, shaded by bamboo, to finally reach it. Mr. Quan greeted him with a hot cup of tea and a firm handshake. After a bit of polite conversation, Jack got straight to the point. "That plot of land, would you consider selling it to me?" Mr. Quan nodded. The land was titled, and though the house was run down, its foundation remained solid. The old farm was now just an overgrown yard with a few scattered fruit trees. He asked for 250 million. Jack didn't haggle, only paused in thought for a few minutes before speaking softly. "How about 210? I'm not buying it to resell. It's for someone who needs a place to feel safe." Mr. Quan studied him for a moment, then gave a faint smile. "You seem sincere, all right? I'll let it go at that price." The deal was wrapped up quickly. They signed the contract that same afternoon, seated at a rickety bamboo table in the center of the old wooden house. Jack transferred the funds immediately and received a neat file of paperwork, the title deed still fresh with the scent of ink and new printing. Stepping out into the yard, Jack looked around at the 300 square meter property where a faded tile-roofed house sat quietly amid an untamed garden. The grass reached above his knees and the bamboo fence was mostly rotted, but to Jack it meant something far more. This wasn't just land. It was a new beginning. He stood in the middle of the yard for a long time, the breeze stirring the banana leaves beside the house. Clutching the folder tightly in his hand, his eyes searched the horizon, imagining the woman who was still out there fighting for a peaceful life. No one knew he bought this land for her, and he didn't plan to tell anyone. All she needed to hear was, "A friend let me borrow it." That would be enough, as long as she could settle without guilt, as long as she had a roof and a path that was hers alone. On his way back, Jack stopped at a local supply store to pick up a few tools and materials to begin repairs. In his mind, he was already seeing a clean little kitchen, a garden full of vegetables, and a girl working quietly under the trees. No longer afraid, no longer needing to bow her head. And if possible, he would stay nearby, always ready to help when she needed it, even if he never said a word. That afternoon, the sky cleared up after a morning rain. When Jack returned home, he found his mother already waiting in the living room. She poured tea for him, handed over a cup, then smiled gently as she asked, "Lately, you've been heading out to the construction site early and coming home late, even taking Tu Tien shopping. Is there something on your mind you haven't told me?" Jack blushed slightly, paused for a few seconds and replied slowly, "I just want to help her get her life back on track. She's been through a lot, and I don't want her to feel like a burden." His mother nodded, calm and composed, her voice gentle. "You have a kind heart, and I'm glad you care. But if you truly love her, don't just help make sure she feels loved, like she has the right to choose herself again." Later that day, Jack drove Tu Tien along a red dirt road that curved around the edge of the village. They passed several hills before turning into a narrow path that led them to the piece of land Jack had bought just the day before. In front of them stood a modest old house with faded tile roofing, surrounded by an overgrown garden. Rusty water jars, a few fruit trees, and a dried-up gourd trellis hinted that this had once been a small farm, now left forgotten. Jack got out of the car first, turned back to her and smiled softly. "Take a look around. If it feels right, you can stay here for a while. It belongs to a friend of mine. He's letting me borrow it long term. No one's been living here, so it'd be a shame to let it go to waste." Tuchian slowly stepped into the yard. She glanced around, eyes filled with emotion. Though the house was old, it was sturdy. A torn hammock still hung on the porch. Dust blanketed the windowsill. She turned to Jack. "But if I stay here, would it trouble you?" Jack looked at her, his voice calm. "I don't feel troubled watching someone live a better life." She bowed her head slightly, saying nothing more. Inside her, a still wave stirred, soft but deep. It had been so long since someone had cared for her in such quiet, thoughtful ways. As the sun dipped lower, Jack handed her the keys before heading out. Before he left, he added, "Call me if you need anything. You're not alone anymore." She stood silently, watching his car disappear beyond the trees, her hand still clutching the keys tightly. A strange feeling rose in her chest, part gratitude, part hesitation. Returning to the house, she began sweeping the yard, wiping down the windows. Every movement was slow but certain. Maybe this was the place where she would truly start again. Not because anyone forced her, but because finally, she wanted it. For herself. Early in the morning, fresh air blanketed the newly acquired land. Tu Tien rose with the first light, tied her hair neatly and began cleaning the garden. She gathered broken bricks scattered across the yard, trimmed overgrown branches that blocked the paths. Though she hadn't yet settled into this new rhythm of life, it already felt lighter than the damp, cramped days she had spent hiding in the forest hut. Jack arrived while she was sweeping the yard. He wore a white hard hat, his sleeves rolled up, holding a phone in one hand as he spoke about work while walking toward her. Tien looked up and greeted him with a polite nod. He smiled back, his expression softer than usual. The land was still cluttered. Tall weeds, scattered debris, leaning fences, and a dusty front porch, but to Tien this place felt like an irreplaceable gift. He asked if she had settled in and whether she needed anything else. She shook her head and said everything was fine, just that it would take some time to tidy up the garden before she could start planting vegetables. Jack nodded and promised to bring more supplies later in the week, if she needed them. He called his mother to check on her health and mentioned that he'd stop by the urban development site later to inspect the progress. His mother said she was feeling much better and reminded him to eat properly. He laughed and teased her. "Mum, you still worry like I'm a 3-year-old. After chatting with Tu Tien for a while, Jack was about to leave but changed his mind when he saw her scrubbing the wooden doors by herself. He decided to stay a little longer to help. Together they cleaned the house, fixed the old water faucet, and carried trash out to the edge of the forest. Jack repaired part of the porch roof using a large tarp, creating a shaded corner where the midday sun wouldn't pour in. As they worked, Jack explained how to sort waste properly, when to water plants, and even considered the best direction to install solar panels so she could have light at night. Tu Tien quietly absorbed every word, her eyes shining like a child being patiently taught something for the first time. By noon, Jack led her to the back garden to pick a handful of fresh tea leaves, then got ready to leave. Before getting in his car, he turned and said, "Just take your time here. Rebuild things slowly. This land is big enough to grow whatever you need. If you need seeds or fertilizer, just let me know." Tu Tien nodded, her heart swelling with emotion she couldn't put into words. He didn't ask about her past, didn't pressure her. He simply stayed close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long while, she believed she could begin again. Not as someone running from the world, but as someone ready to live. That afternoon, Jack returned home after a long day. His mother was sitting on the porch reading, her complexion looking much better than before. He let out a quiet breath of relief and sat down beside her. She turned to him with a gentle smile. "I'm feeling fine now, don't worry so much. Now tell me, how's everything going with Tu Tien?" Jack shared how he had brought her to the old house, how she was now tidying up the place, planning to grow vegetables and raise a few animals. After listening, his mother nodded in approval. She said that as long as the place was safe and helped the girl live in peace, she fully supported it. Then she reminded him to buy her a few more necessities and, if possible, to take her along to visit sometime soon. After dinner, Jack and Huang headed down to the construction site where the new urban area was being developed. The sun was intense, but everyone remained focused. Jack walked through each housing unit, checking progress on 14 homes, 5 of which were nearing completion. He reminded the engineers and workers to stay on schedule, but not at the expense of quality. As he spoke, heads nodded all around. His seriousness and sense of responsibility as a leader were clear to all. Later that night, Jack carried a few packs of instant noodles and stopped by Tu Tien's small home. She was in the garden cutting banana leaves, her hair tied up, a bit of mud on her clothes but her eyes bright. Holding up the noodle bags, Jack smiled. "I'm starving, not sure if you've eaten yet." Tu Tien looked surprised, then laughed. "I was about to cook porridge." So they sat beside the wood stove, boiled water and dropped the noodles into the pot. That humble meal, made from nothing more than a few packs of noodles, felt like the warmest dinner either of them had had in a long time. After eating, Jack said softly, "Tomorrow I'll take you to get a few personal items. That old toothbrush of yours isn't going to last." Tu Tien hesitated, then nodded. "Just the basics, though. Don't get too much." They visited a small convenience store in the village. Jack picked up a blanket, mat, mosquito net, toothbrush and towel, all totaling about 350,000 dong. As they were checking out, the shopkeeper glanced at Tu Tien and muttered under her breath, "Isn't this the girl who left her husband? Tien?" Tu Tien froze, her expression falling instantly. The kind of gossip she had tried so hard to avoid had found her again, right in front of the man she cared about. But Jack remained calm, pulling out his wallet without a word. As they stepped outside, he turned to her and said softly but firmly, "We came here to buy things, not opinions." She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. In the middle of small-town whispers and judgmental stares, to have someone calmly stand by her side like that was more than enough.
Buông những lời cay nghiệt như thể chỉ chờ cơ hội này để trút hết khinh thường lên đầu cô. Cái nhà này cần có cháu đích tôn, chứ không phải cần một người đàn bà vô dụng. Từng lời nói chữ dắt dao cứ sâu vào trái tim tự Tiên. Đôi mắt cô đỏ hoe, bàn tay nắm chặt vào và áo cũ. Cô kìm nén để không bật khóc trước mặt những kẻ chẳng chút thương xót cô. Chiếu, người từng đó tay gối với cô, người từng hứa hẹn bao điều giờ đây lại lạnh lùng đứng nhìn không một chút do dự. Cô đã không còn gì trong ánh mắt anh ta. Nỗi đau không còn dừng lại ở những lời miệt thị khi mẹ chồng lớn tiếng đuổi cô ra khỏi nhà. Tự tin gần như quỵ xuống, cô không biết mình đã làm gì sai ngoài việc sinh ra một trong một số phận bất hạnh. Ngày cô về nhà chồng, cô cũng từng e thẹn bước qua bậc cửa này mang theo bao ước mơ về một mái ấm. Nhưng hôm nay cũng chính bậc cửa đó cô phải rời đi trong tủi nhục, trong sự lạnh lùng của người chồng.